Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another live broadcast. A lovely sunny day. It's a Saturday, and we're a little earlier today because it is Eurovision night. Although Eurovision has been cancelled this year, they are still showing a programme and they're playing all the songs. So Eurovision tonight, and I'll be busy from 6:30. So this is the Kraken's Curse. We're going to read 2 more chapters, and the final part of the story will come very soon because we are on chapter 24 and 25 now. Chapter 24. The Final Battle. The sky broke its silence and whispered quietly across the hilltop, down below the valleys and up above the hills. The blades of grass moved lightly in the breeze as they crossed them, and the leaves shook a little on the trees. Keeping as calm as possible, a small field mouse moved under the hedgerow that marked the edge. It was heading in the direction of the seashore, but when the breeze blew through its fur, it darted back the way it had come. The cover of darkness was an easy deterrent and provided much-needed hiding places for the smallest of creatures. But while they were safe for a little while, hiding in the shadows was also the large and more menacing animals that waited, watched and attacked with the element of surprise. Silently across the cliff top, a large feline creature paced up and down. Its large paws made great prints in the soft earth. This creature was aware of something close by, something it needed protection from. It could smell it. But even though there were many dangers in such a place, they did not stop the creature from continuously padding up and down again and again. On the edge of the grassed area, there was a short line of oak trees, and in front of the trees was a small pile of earth. Standing in front of the earth, as if on guard, were 2 very similar beings. The largest of the beings was dressed in a dark suit and held a battered briefcase in his left hand. The other was dressed in the same, and both had strange devices on their left ears. If you followed the edges of the fields back inland, you would eventually meet a deserted country track that led to the sand dunes of Poole Harbour. The road that was used so little nowadays due to new motorways that had been created, the hedgerows and the verges had grown far further into the road than they should have done, making it hard for any vehicle to pass. But on this particular morning the road was to be used for transport once more, not for a vehicle of any kind, but for animal transport. As the wind blew strongly across the top of the trees, 3 horses appeared beyond the horizon and started to trot down the overgrown road. There were 5 people riding on their backs, and as the horses got a little closer, the people began to talk. "Why are we riding these blessed horses anyway?" muttered McCrae, sitting very uncomfortably on the animal's back. "I'm a sea captain. I ride ships, not blasted horses." Now, Jonathan," Horace smiled. "I've told you many times that we will need some kind of escape plan if we're to succeed in any way whatsoever." "Yes," Arthur agreed, "and a vehicle of any type would not only make it too much noise, but it would not be able to get down this track." "I would like you to stay..." As all 5 dismounted, Horace addressed Beatrice. "I would like you to stay here," he smiled. "You can keep an eye on the horses and warn us of anyone trying to give away our position or attack from behind." "Of course," Beatrice squeaked, pulling her coat tightly around her to keep her out of the wind. The horses were quickly tied up to a nearby tree trunk, and then all 4 adventurers set off across the field and down onto the sand dunes. The further and further Beatrice saw her friends move into the distance, the more and more worried she became for their safety. Slowly she turned away from the sea and shifted her view to the now clearly visible wire cage hanging from her saddle. Inside the cage was the precious silver fox, sleeping silently. The edge of Poole Harbour was protected to the north by long stretches of beautifully golden sand dunes. The dark, murky waters and the thick mud detracted from this, of course, but underneath you could see the beauty that still remained. It was strange to think that this was the place where Arthur had first met Captain Jonathan McCrae, and now he was returning to finally defeat the sea creature that had caused so much misery. They walked to the beach in an orderly fashion. Horace was first, followed by the captain, with Arthur and Megan bringing up the rear. It was already late afternoon, and the shadows were starting to fall upon the grasses that held the rough sands. They must act quickly or else they would lose all light. All 4 paced out onto the broad flat sands and looked out towards the murky waters. Horace knew what he must do in order to bring the Kraken to the surface. It was mentioned in the poem he had sourced several historic references to back it up. He was going to make the first move, and then Arthur would take over for the kill. This time it would work. Cupping his hands slightly, Horace moved away from the rest of the group and concentrated on the dark waters before him. Into his hands he spoke a few words of an ancient language that couldn't be deciphered, and then he waited for the magic to occur. It didn't take long for the golden flames to appear. The golden red licked around his hands and between his fingers, but it did not burn him, for this was a very special form of enchanted fire that would only do the job for which it was designed. When the fire was ready, Horace padded down the seashore, leaned down and blew it into the waves so that little ripples were formed. Then with one swoop of his cupped hands, he dropped the flames onto the surface so that they floated neatly and began to spread across the blackened sea as far as the eye could see. Arthur and the others looked on in astonishment as the fire spread, and they knew that this was it, the final battle had begun. Soon enough, bubbles started popping on the waves. The surface of the sea was beginning to boil. Surely the heat that was rising in the ocean was too much for any creature to bear, and if the poem was right, then this fire heating the deep would cause the Kraken to rise from its sea bed. They were not wrong. It all seemed to happen so quickly. There wasn't any time to act. All four friends just stood there looking and staring in disgust as the hideous creature appeared before them. First, a huge, sickly green tentacle lapped the surface, and following this appeared the very top of the mysterious creature's head. This was it. Everyone here on the seashore was going to see the Kraken on land for the first time in history, for the first time in its most primitive form. The creature was rising surprisingly fast now, its tentacles causing great whirls in the boiling water, and within a few seconds the creature's deadly glare surfaced. There was a look of disgust, anger and resentment in the Kraken's eyes. It seemed to be an emotion that had been tortured and torn across many generations, and now, on the beach, this late afternoon, the Kraken looked old, and everyone knew that he had seen far more things than any of them could ever wish to imagine. For a few moments, the Kraken lifted himself high above the boiling water and floated in the refreshing cool air. The emotion seemed to return to his face, and he turned and looked directly at Arthur, a deathly smile forming across his aged face. "Minions," the Kraken rasped in a tone that was truly hideous. "It is time to act. The end is nigh, and the final battle has now begun." The Kraken's gaze shifted towards the top of the sand dunes, and he waited for his army to attack. That attack never came, though, at least for the Kraken, that is. Arthur, Megan and Captain McCrae ran towards the nearest sand dunes, Horace ducked behind a nearby grass plant, and all four watched and waited. This was when the real trouble began. Nobody seemed to have thought about the situation and thought it through properly. And when the intruders with suitcases and earpieces charged across the sand dunes, they were all surprised by what actually happened. The Kraken was aware first. Quickly he turned his back on the sand dunes and closed his eyes. The razor-sharp beams of light hit like knives in his back, and Arthur's laughter could clearly be heard. The Kraken's minions had turned on him, and instead of aiming their beams in the direction of Arthur and his friends, they were attacking the master who had created them. Across the sands, Horace racked his brains for an answer. The enchanted fire must have done more good than he had first thought, and the boiling water must have destroyed some of the Kraken's dark powers. It was easy. He just had to make Arthur realise that. Luckily, Arthur was now looking in his direction, and with one swift movement of his hands, he made sure that Arthur knew what to do next. "Minions, withdraw!" Arthur shouted clearly and precisely, trying not to catch the Kraken's gaze. Immediately, the creatures with the earpieces and suitcases turned and simultaneously marched back up towards the roadway. The Kraken looked on and slowly floated forwards. He was getting angry. "Captain Jonathan McCrae!" the Kraken screamed. "Where is Captain Jonathan McCrae? He must stand up now and face his destiny, if he wants to save the rest of his little friends." McCrae listened intently, and he knew there was nothing he could do. If he did not step up now, the Kraken would surely kill all of them. He had made so many mistakes in the last few years, and now it was his time to take responsibility for them and secure the future of the whole human race. It was always like him to stand up for something as he paced out towards the parting waves and looked at the Kraken. He knew it might mean certain death. He looked the Kraken directly in the eye and kept thoughts of Arthur and his father George in the front of his mind. "Captain Jonathan McCrae," the Kraken's voice ran out once more. "I have but one simple task for you. One question. You need to answer it correctly, and you will spare the lives of both you and your pathetic friends. It seems like a nice little game, in my opinion." The Kraken gave a laugh that was so hideous it rang around the bay like a harsh bell. Captain McCrae knew that he had only one chance to succeed, one chance to make up for all the things that he had done wrong. It was only when the Kraken asked the question, however, that he felt the dryness on the roof of his mouth. The Kraken's voice was so harsh that he spat out every word. "Jonathan McCrae, why did you desert me? That fateful day in the siege, I cast a spell upon you that made sure you would be my preacher on the land. You openly ignored my instructions and joined the opposition. What is your answer?" Captain Jonathan McCrae had never felt so nervous in his life. In his head, thoughts were rushing, a million reasons, but none that were good enough. The only thing he could do was speak and tell the reason why, and wait to see if it was good enough. Captain McCrae started, but he did not finish. Someone was ready to take over and save the day, answer the Kraken's question, and ultimately admit to a sinister, dark secret. "Wait, Jonathan. You don't have to do this," Horace shouted, running out from the safety of his hiding place. "I know you don't. I know you shouldn't even be here. I should be standing there instead of you." "Explain yourself!" The Kraken glared in the direction of Horace. "Oh, don't you worry," Horace screamed, frenzied and unlike anyone had seen him before. "I'll explain everything. It's my entire fault. I lured you out of your hiding place and you know it. Perhaps it was for my own guilty greed, I don't know, but I know I made a mistake. And the solution to this mistake stepped over my doorstep over a year ago. When I met Arthur, I knew we had a chance. I knew that perhaps finally we could wipe you off the map. Destroy you once and for all. You are an evil creature, perhaps the most evil of all creatures, and all I have ever wanted to do is wipe you from the world." Every word Horace said hit the Kraken like a dart in the heart, and Arthur seemed to be the only one to notice the look on his face. What was Horace doing? Here he was, hiding close with Megan, biding his time, and Horace had just gone and spoiled all of this. "You are an evil man, Horace," the Kraken rasped, still in his floating position. "You supported me in my earliest state, and you helped me to grow. If anything, you should be supporting me now, not losing it all on a whim with this group of nobodies. But you've chosen your fate, and now you and everyone else will have to live with it." Arthur was speechless. Even though Horace had just admitted to working for the Kraken, he didn't feel an ounce of guilt over it. He didn't hate Horace, and in fact he admired him all the more for standing up. It was only now that he realised what must be done. The Kraken began to speak in the same ancient language he had used on the night he had met Arthur's father, and Arthur knew something deadly was about to happen. He didn't have long to wait. Over the top of the sand dunes a creature was prowling, a creature that he had not noticed before, and it seemed to be getting closer. As the Black Panther bounded down across the sands, it left deep paw prints in a straight track. The animal slowed as it reached the beach and began to circle around Horace and the captain. Around the animal's neck was a roll of parchment tied with a cord. Arthur knew what this was the moment he saw it. It was the scroll that Horace had dropped from the helicopter. Turning to Megan, who was cuddled closely at his side, Arthur began to whisper. "Megan," he began, "can you see that the Kraken is getting weaker? I've got to save Horace and the captain, and the only way I can do this is with your help. Can you distract the Kraken for me? Will you do this one thing for me?" Megan smiled and hugged Arthur close. Of course she could do it, and she would do it, for the fate of everyone was in the bay was in her hands. The panther was circling, always circling, in exactly the same way, so that it began to slowly drive Horace and Captain Jonathan McCrae out of their minds. But both were slightly comforted, as from the corner of their eyes they could see Arthur and Megan crawling slowly along the back of the beach and behind the sand dunes. Suddenly there was a large crack like a firework, and the Kraken's attention was diverted for a moment. Horace didn't know how they had done it, but he praised them for it. Where that second earlier Arthur and Megan had been crawling in the sand, there was nothing, but the two of them had moved in this single second, and it was like they had jumped from one point to another instantly. The Kraken had noticed this also. He could sense that someone was now standing directly to the north of where the panther was circling, and it was beginning to make him wary. Slowly, for he was losing strength all the time, the Kraken started to float towards the shoreline and positioned himself directly above the prowling panther. This was just what Arthur wanted. He watched the Kraken move and he waited. He knew what he had to do, and by now he was prepared for it. Reaching for his belt, with one mighty swipe of his hand, Arthur pulled the silver sword high into the air so that it glinted in the sunlight. It was just like his father had done all those years before, and he knew it was right. The Kraken was powering ahead now, but Arthur was hidden so he couldn't be seen. It was only when the Kraken slowed to a stop that Arthur was provided with a chance to attack. The Black Panther paced to the left, leaving an open space, and the Kraken turned to look directly towards Megan. When their eyes met, Megan screamed. "What is wrong with you, girl?" the Kraken laughed madly. "Are you scared of me? Scared I might crush you like an unimportant bug? Well, you are right, for I will kill you now, and perhaps that will prove my strength to your friends." The Kraken gathered all his strength into one movement and surged at Megan, but he never reached her. Just as the Kraken began to move, Arthur raced forwards and the sword was held high and he struck at the back of the Kraken's tentacles. The tentacles were cut clean off and the sword was blemished with a dark green blood. The Kraken screamed out in terror. It was worse than anyone could ever imagine, like the screaming howl of a possessed animal who was being used in some sort of black magic. Arthur could tell how angry the Kraken was, but he couldn't even submit to this anger. The Kraken was greatly weakened by Arthur's exact attack, and now he could not even utter one word. The expression on the face was hatred, but it was mixed with something that proved he might now know the end was near. The Kraken's scream had reached far across the fields, and Beatrice had heard it clearly by the field gate. She took this as a sign and grabbed the wire cage. Then with a quick amble over the wooden fence, she was away and down towards the sand dunes, where the Kraken's figure was just visible. Arthur was so elated by his success that he ran up and hugged Megan tightly and was lost in the moment. Neither Jonathan McCrae and neither of the pair noticed what happened behind them. That was left to McCrae and Horace. The Black Panther that once looked so fearful and dangerous fell to the floor stone cold dead. There it lay like a fearful animal finally at rest, and in death it looked strangely surreal and comforting. Horace took 3 large steps forwards and swiped the scroll cleanly away from the panther's neck. "Success!" he shouted with a smile, causing Arthur and Megan to turn in surprise and the Kraken to lure backwards. But Horace was not aware of McCrae hot on his heels. The elderly sea captain pushed behind Horace, knocking him to the ground and tried to grab the scroll from him. Horace, you can't do this. It's not right." He leered, suddenly more angry than worried. "It's me that should be reading from the scroll." But Horace was not having any of it. He pushed the sea captain away so that he rolled over in the rough sand. Then he ran forwards and sat down right beside the Kraken. Horace wasn't scared anymore. How could he be? Everything he had done in his long life came down to this moment, and as he slowly unrolled the ancient scroll, he knew that he was about to do what would secure everyone's future. The scroll was covered in a language that could hardly be read. It was as old as the hills and had many more characters than the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. But even though this language was undecipherable, Horace could read every word. "Sha le ma debinjun, alectun le merandijantas. Il digre bot la metro de man le mare." It was strange to see Horace read from this ancient manuscript. He was speaking in a language that nobody could understand, yet he was speaking it as if it was something he did every day. The only person in the group who seemed to be fazed by what was being said was the Kraken himself. He seemed to be very aware that Horace was now in control of the scroll once again, and that he was reading from the very same extract that the Kraken himself had read such a long time before. As the reading went on and Horace continued to gabble, something strange happened. Everyone's eyes were on Horace and everyone was staring in disbelief, when the words he was speaking suddenly began to translate into clear English. The scroll seemed to be working its magic, and every single word could now be understood. But as with most things, there was always something bad to coincide with something good. Arthur noticed it first, a tiny blotch in the middle of Horace's cheek, and then it was noticed by Beatrice. In fact, by the time this strange phenomenon had come to the attention of all who were present, the blotch had begun to expand, covering Horace's face. Horace was beginning to age, and it wasn't a slow aging process that you might witness in a human or any other animal, but it was a rapid aging spurt that quickened with every word that was spoken. His eyes were darkening, his skin sagging, and soon enough he was a shadow of his former self. It was painful to watch, agonisingly painful. Horace was screaming out inside for help, but he just could not let anyone else on the beach near his pleas. "Alone, alone," Horace muttered in a voice that was not his own. "Always alone." "What does he mean, alone?" Arthur shouted, suddenly breaking the monotonous tones that had filled such a long period of time. "Why is he doing this? He's giving his life for us, and I just can't bear to look." And so he didn't. Arthur drew his eyes away from the frail and pain-ridden Horace and looked directly at the hideous creature in front of him. Although he dared not look, Arthur kept his ears open and was not surprised at all when Horace began to speak the words of Tennyson's poem. It was perhaps a little ironic, but now that such things were taking place, nothing seemed beyond possibility. "I who light the fire of the deep," Horace continued, short of breath. I, who will be the one to rid this land of the ancient creature, hath troubled and bestowed venom upon it, will give my last breath for the cause, but will be remembered for all eternity. Then once by man and angels be seen, in roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. Beatrice ran forwards first, for she was waiting for it. Her arms were outstretched, and she caught Horace as he fell backwards. His face was as old as the sky, and almost all the hair had fallen from his head. It was there on the beach at the edge of Poole Harbour that everything ended, and slowly Beatrice began to cradle Horace peacefully backwards and forwards in her arms, as everyone else ran forwards. They weren't scared anymore. How could anyone be scared? The Kraken was still high above them, and even though he had begun to roar with a deafening sound that rose above the very world itself, time seemed to stop for just a few moments. A few peaceful but saddening moments as everyone gathered around. They moved in tight, Beatrice in the middle, Jonathan McCrae at the right side with his sea cap against his chest, and directly opposite Arthur and Megan held each other as tightly as possible. Horace had given his life for the cause, and it was such a horrible way to leave this cruel world. Beatrice was still moving Horace backwards and forwards as he slowly closed his eyes and jarred to one side. Almost like split-second gunfire, everyone was brought back to reality, and their ears were filled with a terrible screaming, a painful roaring, and a wind that almost blew them off the beach and into the sky. The Kraken was high above now, and everyone had to crane their necks to get a view. The hideous creature they had once been so scared of was spinning quickly in a circle and seemed to have no control. The Kraken knew it was the end. He knew that his years of painful dictatorship were over, and as quickly as he had once been spinning, the creature stopped and looked out across the harbour. His kingdom was laid out before him, the land of which he had once been a ruler, and which had finally reduced him to the pathetic scum that he was. The Kraken was so pale, he was almost transparent. His mouth was slurred to the side, but he still managed to whisper one word in the same hideous voice that he had used for many millennia. Death. The rasping word escaped from the creature's lips, and then he was no more. A million tiny snowflakes were falling down to the ground that surrounded everyone present and onto the sand dunes. These snowflakes had a strange green tinge, and as Arthur looked onwards he realised that this was the end, and he could finally free his father from a timeless existence. It all seemed to happen so quickly. One minute they were fighting a raging battle, and the next they were alone on the sands, one less without a great friend. But something else was happening, something controlled by the snow that would lay everything to a final and resounding peace. On the far side of the beach, the black panther that the Kraken had once used for attack was beginning to glow and very slowly change. The animal's body thinned and faded into that of a young man, and within a few moments the head was visible. The man seemed to be wearing some strange tribal clothing, and as Arthur scanned the horizon, he noticed the man was gabbling in a strange tongue. It was obvious that he had been locked inside this animal's body for far longer than was humanly possible, and with the little strength that he could muster, the man took one look in Arthur's direction and ran off back across the sand dunes, still gabbling. Close to the seashore, Beatrice was silently weeping over the body in her arms. It was Captain McCrae that first noticed the change, and Beatrice soon stopped to look. The aged figure before them was glowing and starting to change, not unlike the panther had done a few minutes before. It was a strange sort of milky glow that gave off an air of happiness, which alerted everyone to the goodness it was about to do. Horace was now a much younger man, a man who they all recognised as a feisty and vibrant character they once knew, a man who they would much prefer to remember than the one they had seen over the sand dunes during the battle. It was clear to everyone that Horace was now sure to be at peace forevermore. Chapter 25. Poole Harbour. It was over. The battle had been won. The soldiers lay exhausted and defeated on the sand, the scars of the fight overwhelming them. It had been hard, but they had done it. They had completed the task for which their whole journey of discovery had been the cause. The battle had caused them the greatest of losses, the loss of a dearly loved companion, but they had one consolation in the truth that the land was now at peace. All around them were the bodies of Ottain's army, unfortunate creatures that had been drafted into a battle they did not want to fight and had died in vain. The patch of damp sand from where the Black Panther had changed still remained, and the waves still rushed to the shore. Now was the time for peaceful reflection, yet life was carrying on regardless, and it was hard to come to terms with it. But before they could escape the hideous happenings that occurred on this beach, there was one more thing left to do. Arthur, Megan and Captain McCrae had joined in a group at the waves and were pacing up and down the seashore deep in conversation. "I can't believe it," Arthur spoke to the others. "It all seems so quiet and peaceful now, as if nothing has happened." "I know what you mean, Arthur," Captain Jonathan McCrae replied. "It's like a burden has been lifted from me, and I feel so much better about it." "It doesn't make it any better that you have lost a dear friend, though, does it?" Megan whispered, obviously deeply affected by what had happened. It had in fact opened her eyes greatly. Arthur pulled close and placed his chin on the top of her head. "We're all going to miss Horace," he cooed. "But from this day forwards, we've got to remember him as the vibrant and extravagant man that he was, and try to get on with our lives. It's what he would have wanted." "Hear, hear," Captain Jonathan McCrae replied, and paced off towards where Horace's body lay. Walking slowly, Arthur acknowledged Beatrice, and she knew exactly what he wanted. Slowly she placed the wire cage down on the sand and lifted the cover. Quick as a flash, the silver fox darted out of the cage and onto the sands. Being locked up in a cage for days on end is a very strenuous thing, and the creature was glad to be able to stretch his legs for once. It was also quite obvious that the silver fox knew the Kraken was dead, for he was far more vibrant and exuberant in his personality than he had been only days earlier. Arthur was pacing up and down with his father's diary in his hand. He had carried it all the time, and he had realised early on that this was it, that finally it had given him the courage to defeat the Kraken. From the corner of his eye he could just see the wisp of silver darting around the beach, and it only made him even more anxious to find a solution. Arthur was getting scared. He had always thought that his father would be freed upon the death of the Kraken, and he readied Beatrice for this. But when the time had come, the Kraken's final stand, everyone had been concentrating too much on Horace to notice anything else that might be going on. And in any case, the magic, if there was any, had not worked, and Arthur was still looking at his dear father, racing around the beach, locked in the form of a silver fox. "Megan," Arthur called over the top of his diary that he was still avidly flicking through, "I need your help." "What is it?" Megan asked worriedly, rushing to Arthur's side. "It's your father, isn't it?" "I just can't seem to find any questions or answers," Arthur whispered desperately. "It all seems completely helpless." It was then that something strange occurred. Whether the silver fox knew what he was doing or not, it certainly changed the situation. Surging forwards, the silver fox suddenly changed direction and headed straight towards Arthur and Megan. Running between the pair, it managed to knock Arthur off his feet and send a diary he was holding up into the air. The pages flew backwards and forwards in the wind, and quickly it plummeted to the earth and landed in the wet sand on the edge of the waves. Arthur fell just behind and got a mouthful of salty water, which he was not best pleased about. Megan quickly reached down, scooped up the diary and waited for Arthur to join her. When she looked at the sodden page, she was rather surprised at what she found there. Arthur stood behind Megan and read over her shoulder. It seemed to be a note from Arthur's father to Captain Jonathan McCrae, which had been written many years ago. "Jonathan," Arthur called, "come and have a look at this." The sea captain, who had just returned from placing Horace's body in a respectful position, placed towards them. He stood next to Arthur and read avidly. "Ah, I see," he smiled. "I remember your father telling me this about Arthur. But he warned me it should only be used as a last resort." "Well, I can't think of any other ideas," Arthur replied impatiently. "Can you?" "Your father's exact words were that if the Kraken was to be killed, and the waters were to change from a muddy brown colour to their original sparkling blue, there would be no further way to save him." The captain finished with a satisfied smile on his face, for he knew exactly what Megan was going to say next. "But look at the water," she grinned, looking out towards the edge of the horizon. "They're still as colourless as they ever were, and they're still full of mud." "Exactly like they were on the first day that I met you, Arthur. Do you remember?" "Yes, of course," Arthur answered almost immediately. "It was a strange chance meeting, but you are right. The waters were this colour." "And the only one who can lift the spell is you, Arthur." Captain McCrae patted Arthur on the back. "There's a myth around these parts," he continued, mimicking the voice he had used on the day he had first met Arthur. "I'm a sea captain, so I should know. And no, I do. In fact, in case you hadn't realised yet, I am happy to tell you, Arthur, that the myth revolves around you. I told you your part of this back in the village hall that night, but I purposely left another bit out. You're the one who will rid the land of an ancient evil and risk friends and family in the process. But you will ultimately save the one who means the most to them." Arthur was completely shell-shocked. He hadn't realised for one second that he might be the one Captain McCrae was talking about on that day that he had met. And now, all he needed to know was what he had to do to finally free his father and put all the past memories to rest. But what do I do? Arthur asked, bewildered. Ah, that is simple, Captain McCrae jested. Beatrice, if you could kindly pick up our friend the Silver Fox and pass him to Arthur, we may continue. And Beatrice did. The Silver Fox had stopped and was waiting obediently at her side. Good. Now all you have to do, Arthur, is dunk the fox, or should I say your father, under the water, and at the same time say your late mother's name. It was always your father's strongest magic. To Arthur this didn't seem strange. He found it very humbling that his father would wrap his strongest magic around the memory of his wife, and it was amazing that such a simple thing might be able to free him from this prison. Walking slowly into the dirty waters, Arthur carried the Silver Fox up high. The deeper and deeper he walked, the thicker the mud got. By the time he was deep enough to dunk the fox right under, he was almost sunk to his knees. But he didn't mind. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered, as long as this was going to get his father back. And with one big sweep of his hands, Arthur raised the Silver Fox high into the air and brought him down quickly so that his whole body was under the water. Then he shouted one word with such emotion and with such a tone that it made even the greatest magician proud. Lillian, Amy, he shouted, and then he let go. The Silver Fox didn't struggle. He didn't try to break free. He just took the dunking like it was the final punishment in a long line of distress and heartache. For a fox, he was very smart. Those two words, that name, made sense to him. The magic was finally returning to him. He was alive and falling towards the mud and the dirt and the dark. His mind was quickly filled with colour, pictures and memories, landscapes and scenery. They were the things he had never witnessed as a fox and the things that he missed the most. He saw images of his son as a small child, dancing around the garden with his mother just behind. He saw his wedding day and he felt the happiness. These were the things that he had been locked away from for so long. A million tiny images were now dancing before the animal's eyes, and slowly, very slowly, the change began to take place. The change from animal to human. George Boston was reborn, and he felt so. The first thing Arthur noticed was when he dunked the Silver Fox beneath the waves, the animal did not struggle. Instead, he broke free from Arthur's grasp and began to sink towards the seabed and the endless mud. Arthur began to get worried. What was going to happen now? His father's future was to be decided in the next few seconds, and if anything went wrong, Arthur knew he would never be able to forgive himself. But he didn't have long to wait, however, for no sooner had the fox broken free, things began to happen. The first obvious change was the water. It was not a sudden change, but it did happen quickly. Captain Jonathan McCrae and Megan could see the edge, and it was from here that they noticed the colours fading back into real life. Just as if an immense paint pot had been dropped into the seas of Poole Harbour, a glorious shimmering blue began to seep across the blackness of the waves. The endless mud was engulfed with a rich golden yellow sand, so that you could see right to the seabed from wherever you stood. As the original colours, which had not been seen for many, many years, reached Arthur in the edge of the seashore, the silver could easily be seen floating just below the surface. The animal seemed so peaceful. It seemed as though he belonged here, a strange sort of water fox or foxfish. But it wasn't long before Arthur noticed a change that he had witnessed twice before, and one that he knew would make everything right. The Silver Fox began to glow. It wasn't the same glow that everyone had witnessed upon their great friend Horace. This was different. This glow was a strange dark silver, and the fox suddenly stirred from his sleep and began to race around in circles under the waves, apparently chasing his tail. Then, as if it were a normal thing to do, a wave of gigantic proportions formed on the horizon and began to speed towards them. Arthur didn't have time to get back to the sand dunes. He just stared at the oncoming wave and let it engulf him, like a tiny fish in the mouth of a gigantic whale. Crash! The wave hit the sand and broke, leaving the two very bedraggled characters lying in the surf. Captain McCrae ran down to the edge of the beach and beckoned to Megan to follow. There in the damp sand was a sopping wet Arthur, with his hair covering his eyes. Megan ran up to him and hugged him so tight that she thought she would never be able to let him go. Captain Jonathan McCrae just stared, but he wasn't staring at Arthur. It was the other person lying on the sand. It was Arthur's father, George Boston, dressed in the same blue jeans and white t-shirt that he had worn on the night he had ventured to the top of the village to meet Ottane. Captain McCrae could not believe it. The friend he knew was back, and he felt a sudden urge to shake his hand in disbelief. George Boston looked left and right and rubbed his eyes. He couldn't believe where he was. He noticed his son standing in the surf in a tight embrace with Megan, and he just couldn't resist having the first word. "My son!" he shouted, running towards Arthur, his arms wide open. "You did it! Oh, son, I've missed you so much!" "I've missed you too, father," Arthur whispered, however strange it sounded. "That's why I've done all this. I'd done it for you. Then Arthur smiled, and George smiled, and everyone on the beach started laughing. This was it. This was how everything was supposed to be. The puzzle and the quest had been completed here on the beach, and now everything was perfect. It took Arthur days to really accustom to the successes he had achieved, and to the highlights that he had climbed. He really couldn't believe it, but yet deep in his heart he knew that he had done the right thing. Only a few hours after the group had left the beach, George Boston was confined to bed with a mystery illness. He was now in the safe hands of the captain, however, who assured Arthur that he would make a full recovery. And so Arthur waited and waited. He thought about what he would say to his father when he could finally have a conversation at length, and he worried about whether his father would be the same. After all, he had been through so much. But out of all the scenarios that Arthur had gone through in his head, it was the one that followed a week later which really surprised him and made him happier than he ever thought he could be. So there you go. That would be chapters 24 and 25, and we've come towards the end of the story now, and tomorrow night I should be back to read chapters 26 and 27. Really hope that you can join me at 6 p.m. tomorrow. Thank you. Cheers for joining me tonight.